I'm certainly not a theologian, and I'm also not a traditional economist. But I do think that what I'm working on actually does bring the human person back into economics a little bit. So what I thought I'd do today is talk about this new, it's really becoming a new science of well-being measurement, what I think it can contribute to economics and to policy, and to some of the questions that are on the table today. Good, I can work the clicker. So until about 5 years ago, there were just a few crazy economists, about 5 of us, maybe 8, working with psychologists and using happiness surveys in economics to try and understand the determinants of happiness, human happiness. And at that point, we didn't use the term well-being. We used the term happiness because happiness was the questions in the surveys we were using. But we also started to learn a lot from the psychologists we were working with about refining the concept of happiness into a much broader concept, or broadening it and being much more specific within the broader concept of well-being. But we went from being crazy outliers to a point today that I sort of can't believe the speed at which there is a remarkable interest in the topic, not just in academic circles. There are about 1,000 articles a year with happiness in the title in mainstream economic journals now, which is crazy considering that we were really thought to be nuts. I was told by the director of economic studies at Brookings about 10 years ago, who's a good friend and colleague of mine. He said, Carol, this is a great manuscript, but you've got to take happiness out of the title because nobody will take you seriously. So I kept it in the title, and I didn't sell many books. In 2009, I wrote a book entitled Happiness Around the World, The Paradox of Happy Peasants and Miserable Millionaires, and it was all over the place. Science, The New Yorker, New York Times. I don't really think it was that much a better book. I think it really reflects how much interest in this topic has developed over time. And as I mentioned, it's not just in academia, but really in the policy domain, and not just the remote country of Bhutan, who many of you have heard of in terms of gross national happiness, but really, governments around the world are starting to incorporate these metrics into their national statistics. The UK already has well-being questions in its national statistical survey. The OECD has issued detailed guidelines for statistics offices around the world for how to include well-being metrics into statistical efforts. And many other countries, the Chinese are incredibly interested or worried about unhappiness in their country, and maybe it's not a surprise, both my books are out in Chinese. And even the U.S., Joe Hotz and I just served on a National Academy of Sciences panel where we were asked or tasked with recommending which well-being metrics we should consider for our own statistical gathering efforts. So it really has gone from being sort of way out there, sort of a loopy branch of economics, to being mainstream not just in at least some economic circles, but really in policy circles. So I wanted to talk today about 3 themes that are key to my work. I think they pose challenges to the policy applications of happiness or well-being metrics. And I think they're themes that speak very much to human fulfillment and the human person. So one is why the particular definition of well-being matters, and how the definition of well-being that individuals emphasize or think about when they think about their own happiness, it relates to how much agency they have, how much ability they have to control their own lives. Then I wanted to talk about adaptation and progress paradoxes. It sort of fits into the addiction sort of stories that were talked about yesterday. How many aspirins do you need? And then lastly, a question that I think we haven't solved yet, but certainly we need to if we're thinking in the policy arena, and that is, what is a meaningful change in well-being? But before I do that, turn to those themes, I want to just tell you a little bit about the approach and a little bit about the main findings that we have that are just consistent across countries, people around the world. So with this approach, using surveys of people's reported well-being, we can answer questions as diverse as the effects of commuting time on well-being. Commuting time turns out to be the least happy time of the day. Why cigarette taxes make smokers happier. They do. I'm happy to answer why in the questions. Why the unemployed are less unhappy when there are more unemployed people around them. right? So when unemployment rates are higher. Now, standard economics would say if you're unemployed and the unemployment rate's higher, that should make you unhappy because your probability of being reemployed is lower. Well, it turns out a lot of the work that's been done on local unemployment rates find that unemployed people are less unhappy when there are more unemployed people around them. You know, why would this be? There's less stigma, there are people to play backgammon with, whatever it is. It's a quirky finding, but it's the kind of thing that we find when we measure well-being this way rather than in traditional income terms. So this method is particularly well suited for answering questions that revealed preferences don't answer very well, right? Instead of the standard revealed preferences approach based on consumption frameworks, we're using survey data. And the reason it's good for some questions that revealed preferences don't get at very well is that there are situations where people just don't have the agency to reveal a preference or make a choice, or when consumption decisions are not the result of optimal choices. All of you know from behavioral economics that people consume in ways that seem to make no sense or don't seem rational, right? There are all these examples that people will spend $20 on gas and drive 40 miles to save 20 cents a roll on toilet paper, things like that. That consumption choices are certainly not always rational. We find, for example, cigarette smokers are less happy than non-smokers. But if their revealed preferences would say that's an optimal choice within a budget framework, they're making welfare-enhancing choices. Obviously, they're not. There are many examples like that. So I work on two particular areas. One is macro and institutional arrangements that individuals are powerless to change. So think about a poor peasant in Bolivia who's made unhappy, or not, we don't know, by inequality. Well, short of emigrating or protesting, there's no way that poor peasant can reveal a preference about inequality, right? But that institutional or macro framework may have a well-being effect, and we can measure that with survey data. And then the second set of things that I work on are behaviors that are not driven by optimal choices, but by imposed norms or by addiction and self-control problems. So I talked about cigarette smokers. Another example is behaviors, when you observe behaviors among very poor people that either that don't seem to be exercising choice or don't make sense. Take the example of somebody from a lower caste in India who doesn't send his or her child to school. Now, is that really an observed choice? And are there welfare effects? Well, if the person's been told you're in a lower caste, your child is going to be in a lower caste, not going anywhere, schools are bad, often dangerous, that's a situation, it's an unfortunate situation where strong norms are imposing a behavior, but I don't think that's a revealed preference. And again, we can measure the welfare effects of that situation. Now, one thing, though, as we've gone from just academic measurement and lots of interesting questions that we can measure, but as the discussions have now moved to, beyond just how can we better understand human well-being, to whether or not happiness is an appropriate objective of policy, there are a number of questions I think that we need to resolve. One is what definition of happiness is most relevant and appropriate for policy. As I said early on, we just used whatever questions were in the survey and interchanged life satisfaction, happiness, whatever we had, and now we're getting much more refined about the terminology, and I'll say a bit more about that. Another question is, how does the definition of happiness vary across people and across societies? And then lastly, how do people's capabilities mediate the dimension of well-being that matters most to them? So in terms of terminology, happiness is obviously what captures all the public attention. It's a term that's in the Declaration of Independence, although it's the pursuit of happiness and not a guarantee of happiness. But still, it's the sort of common term. It's the most open-ended of the evaluative well-being questions we use. It doesn't impose a definition of happiness on the respondent. He or she defines happiness for themselves as they answer a question which says, generally speaking, how happy are you with your life? The question has to be asked first in the survey, though, because you never want to ask these open-ended happiness questions after 10 questions about do you like your job or do you have enough money or how's your marriage, because it would bias things in lots of different ways. Life satisfaction, very similar question. How satisfied are you with your life in general? That correlates very closely with happiness questions, except it's a little more of a framed question, because if you ask somebody, how satisfied are you with your life as a whole, most people do think about their life as a whole, their overall circumstances, maybe what they will achieve or have achieved. And it turns out that this question correlates more closely with income than open-ended happiness does, because people with more income have more choices in their lives, right? So they can, when they think of their life as a whole, they've probably been able to make more choices. Another question that is in the Gallup World Poll, which a lot of scholars are using now, is an old sociological question of Howard Cantrell's. It's a ladder of life question, and it asks respondents to compare their life to the best possible life they can imagine, and to put themselves on a 10-point ladder or scale where the best possible life is 10 and the worst possible life is 1. Well, this is a much more, this is imposing a relative concept on well-being, right? And it turns out that this question correlates much more closely with income, both within and across countries, than open-ended life satisfaction questions. Just to give you an example, we did the first pilot study of well-being in Afghanistan, and we found that people in Afghanistan scored, and this was not in the violent parts, obviously, but people in Afghanistan scored higher on happiness in general than the world average, and they scored higher on smiling yesterday than the world average. But when we asked them the best possible life question, they scored significantly lower. Because if you, again, you frame it, somebody in Afghanistan knows that, if you make it relative, then people think in relative terms. Then a whole second dimension of well-being, hedonic well-being, measures how people experience their daily lives. What's their mood, positive or negative, smiling or worried as they go through their daily activities. And we tend to measure hedonic well-being with questions that capture positive and negative affect. So how often did you smile yesterday? How often were you happy? Did you feel happy yesterday? Or how often were you worried yesterday? Did you experience stress yesterday? And psychologists make the point that life satisfaction works on a sort of a 1 scale. So 0 or 1 is bad and 10 is good, right? And it runs in a continuum. But that you can't sort of put, with hedonic well-being and positive and negative affect, you can't put smiling at 10 and worry at 1. That they're different emotions, and people can have positive and negative affect in the same day. Then subjective well-being is all of the ways in which people report their well-being and encompasses all of this range of surveys that we're using. So what do we know? What do we know from some of the basic, the hundreds of studies now across countries and over time? Well, one thing that in fact stirred up a lot of interest in this whole area is something called the Easterland Paradox, and economists argue a lot about whether there is or isn't an Easterland Paradox. So Easterland's Paradox is basically saying that it has 2 dimensions. One's over time and one is across countries. So he basically said, as countries grew wealthier over time, average happiness levels did not increase. So the U.S. grew more quickly than any other OECD country until about 2001, and average happiness levels were flat for 3 decades. Japan quintupled its income in 3 decades, and average happiness levels fell. And then across countries, at any point in time, it's not clear that the relationship between average levels of income and average levels of life satisfaction or happiness is a linear one. There's a lot of debate about this. It turns out it really matters what question you use. If you use the best possible life question, you get a much more linear relationship. But if you look at this chart, you actually could argue lots of ways. You could argue that there is an Easterland Paradox or there isn't an Easterland Paradox, and we could probably spend the whole day on it, but we won't. But if you look at it, the wealthy countries, this is GDP per capita adjusted. This is percent above neutral for a country on average life satisfaction. So the wealthy countries are all up there: Netherlands, U.S., Switzerland, Sweden, Australia, Japan. They're clearly, on average, happier than the poorer countries. Well, it turns out, but there's not a linear relationship among the wealthy countries, right? There are wealthier countries that are less happy, below the line, and so on. And if you look at the poorer countries, there's much more variation. They're all over the place. Well, why is that? It's because average per capita GDP is picking up a lot of country-level unobservables that also matter to well-being. So some countries, like I'm from Peru, and Latin America is a good place to live and pretty happy people. They're way above the line. And that's not just a sort of cheerfulness effect. It's the fact that they're democracies. They have good quality of life, reasonable public goods. Some of these countries way down here below the line, Iraq, Pakistan, Tanzania, Belarus, they're not democracies. They're violent. They're awful places to live, and lack of freedom, violence are terrible for well-being. So, and as a lot people, countries at lower levels of average GDP can still have democracy and health and all kinds of things, and it shows up in their well-being. Now, there's a problem with these cross-country comparisons. Everybody likes to pay attention to them, the news media in particular, because they always want to know, how happy is my country compared to another country. When we did the first well-being study in Latin America, it was all over the front page papers, Chileans are happier than Peruvians, and then the Colombians had a front page story, we are not the least happy country on the continent. But the one problem with these country-level comparisons is you're not controlling for anything, so you're just taking average country responses, right? And so you're picking up cultural differences in the way people answer surveys. So, for example, if you look there, France is below the line, right? But some of that's just cultural, the way the French answer and speak. My grandmother was from Paris, and I know you don't run around in Paris saying, have a nice day, right? In contrast, I had a British friend who got so tired of being told to have a nice day in the U.S. that she started saying, thank you, I have other plans. So they're just, there are country-level differences. In Latin America, there is a sort of cheerfulness effect that drives up the scores. But really where we're much more robust in measuring is at the individual level, where we're taking hundreds of thousands of respondents across countries over time and controlling for all kinds of things. And then we really are much better at measuring individual level well-being and its determinants. So here is something that holds in everywhere I've studied it, ranging from most recently Mongolia to the US, Europe, and Africa. So this is happiness in age, and this chart will make you happy or unhappy depending where you are on it. So this is years of age, level of happiness. This is for Latin America. The turning point for Latin America is about 48 years, so I'm feeling pretty good right now. But for the US, it's about 44. For Russia, unfortunately, it's about 55 or 60, which is beyond life expectancy for Russian males. So maybe it turns up when all the men die off. I don't know. So what's going on here? Now, this chart is adjusted for age-adjusted health, right? So you're not expecting that a 75-year-old will have the same health as a 25-year-old, but it is adjusted for reported health and for being in a stable partnership, both of which are very important to well-being. Well, it turns out that the middle-age years are precisely as predicted, right? There are often double burdens of dependent children and dependent parents, sometimes teenage children. I have 3. They seem to be okay, but apparently they can be a big burden. There's also kind of aspirations and aligning with reality effect. By the time you're mid-40s or late 40s, if you haven't figured out what you're going to be when you grow up, it's probably time. Psychologists find that younger people have more emotional swings in their well-being. So if you think about it, it makes sense. When you're young, if you have one bad event, you don't have all these other bad events to benchmark it against. So a bad event can make you extremely unhappy. As you get older, you've navigated a lot of bad events. And then if you just go up the chart, there are a couple of things going on. One, there's a selection bias because happy people live longer, right? So the less happy people are dying off. And at the very end, our oldest respondent in this survey was 99. There could be a happy to be alive effect, and there could even be a senility effect. I don't know, but what is remarkable is how consistent this pattern is everywhere in the world. And my colleague Andrew Oswald from the UK has actually found he's even found a U-shaped pattern in the life satisfaction of apes, however you measure ape life satisfaction. But there's something biological going on as well. So what else do we know about consistent determinants of happiness around the world? And then because we know these things are very consistent, we can control for them and explore the effects of things that vary. So I've talked about age, income. Whatever you say about the complexities of the well-being or happiness and income relationship, income does matter. So within countries, individuals who have more means are happier than those that don't have means. And being destitute is terrible for well-being, however you measure it. Of course, after a certain amount of income, the relationship gets more complicated, and things like comparison effects and other things come into play. But income does matter. Health is more important to well-being than income. Very important variable. Employment. Everywhere we've studied happiness or well-being, unemployed people are significantly less happy than employed people. And it turns out that long-term spells of unemployment are one thing that people never adapt back from. People are amazingly adaptable and can adapt back to lots of bad things and go back to their sort of average levels of well-being, but long-term unemployment seems to have psychological scarring effects, which is a pretty daunting thing if you consider what's going on with long-term unemployment in the U.S. and Europe right now in particular. Marriage. We are always looking at a cross-section and finding that married people or people in a stable partnership are happier than those who aren't. There's a problem, because we're really picking up a selection bias that happier people are more likely to marry each other, right? So you're comparing these two happier people who married each other to the people who didn't, the less happy people. If you look, the few studies there are over time find that the additional effect of just getting married, right, beyond whatever well-being levels the two people had beforehand, lasts about a year, and then they go back to where they were before their marriage. And there's a paper by a colleague of mine in France, Claudia Senek, called "You Can't Be Happier Than Your Wife." It turns out the probability of divorce is highest when you have asymmetries in happiness levels. So it's better to have two happy people married to each other or two unhappy people married to each other, but you don't want a happy person and an unhappy person married to each other because they drive each other crazy. Friendships, people who have friends socialize are happier than those that don't. Again, there's a direction of causality problem because happier people are more likely to socialize. Women are, on average, happier than men around the world, except in places where gender rights are compromised. And people ask me about religion a lot, and I know for this audience it's obviously a very relevant question. I didn't put it on this slide because these are the things that we know are consistent everywhere. Religion, in places where religion is a moderate force, is typically associated with higher levels of well-being. In fact, there's a study in Europe that shows that even atheists are happier when they live in more religious neighborhoods. So they're obviously sort of positive social externalities from being around religious people. But again, we also don't know the direction of causality. We've done some work on religion, and we find, for example, if you look at the distribution of well-being across people, that happier people are more likely to be religious. So it's a complicated question. We also know where religion is a divisive force, right, where it's sort of creating ethnic tensions and extreme religion, then the positive effect of religiosity goes away. So these are the things that we know are consistent, and because of these things, we can control for these things and then look at the effects of things that vary. So I'm not going to walk you through econometric equations, but there's a reason for showing you how this works. Because what we do is we have, whatever our whether it's life satisfaction, happiness, best possible life, our well-being variable on the left-hand side, and then we control for all these things that we know, right? Age, income, health, education, and then we can look at the effects of things that vary: inflation and unemployment rates, environmental quality, personal behaviors such as running, smoking, exercises. We can look at an amazing number of questions, and that makes it a really exciting field to be involved in. But the point of putting this slide up is that we're not asking people, does commuting time make you unhappy, or does smoking make you unhappy? We're looking at similar people, with their reported well-being on the left side, and two similar people, one who smokes and one who doesn't, and see the additional effect of smoking, for example. Now, this sort of measurement approach works very well from a research perspective, and we've been able to uncover lots and lots of great data and answer all kinds of questions. The policy arena is blunt and brutal, and I work in D.C., so I know it all too well. And here we need much more clarity on what well-being dimension we're measuring before you toss this into sort of any kind of policy discussion. There's a chapter in my book called "Should We Have Bentham or Aristotle in the Statistics Office?" And it reflects the broad agreement among scholars involved in the study of well-being that there are two related but clearly distinct dimensions of well-being. Jeremy Bentham's concept of well-being was maximizing the contentment and pleasure of the greatest numbers of individuals as they experience their lives on a day-to-day basis. And that's what we call hedonic, or experience well-being. And then Aristotle thought of happiness as eudaimonia, a Greek word that combines two concepts, eu meaning well-being or abundance, and daemon meaning the control of an individual's destiny. And that falls under the rubric of what we call evaluative well-being, how people evaluate their lives as a whole. And it implicitly includes the opportunity to lead a purposeful or meaningful life. Hedonic well-being measures are good for assessing quality of life at the moment, right? How are people experiencing their lives? How are people being taken care of in an end-of-life care situation? That kind of thing. The metrics capture sort of day-to-day movements. And then evaluative well-being is better for assessing people's capacities to make choices and to seek fulfilling lives. And obviously, both dimensions are important. My own work focuses much more on the latter, but I think both are. We need to understand both. So, to the questions I posed earlier, this whole issue of agency, people's ability to make choices and control their own lives, I think really mediates what dimension of well-being people are emphasizing when they answer surveys. I'm known in the literature for something called the happy peasant and frustrated achiever problem. And you often get very poor people reporting to be very happy, despite pretty difficult circumstances. So what dimension are they emphasizing when they report to be happy? So lacking capacity due to poverty or strong norms, people may place more value on the simple day-to-day component of living. We find that poor people depend more on religion as a safety net versus people with more means seem to go to religion more in a social purpose sense. That's what we find across worldwide data. So when people with very limited means say they're very happy, they're typically thinking, I'm okay today, I have my family, I'm not starving, I have my friends. When you ask them a more relative question as the best possible life question, then they will score lower. People with more capacity and more choices may have less time and interest in day-to-day experience, particularly if they're focused on some overarching objective or achievement. It's a little bit like, being in grad school, right? You know that every moment won't be, a laugh every day, but you've got a broader objective in mind. So it turns out the data show this. Danny Kahneman and Angus Deaton have a paper on income and well-being in the U.S. that shows that income and experience well-being, right, this hedonic dimension, correlate only up to median levels of income, and then there's no relationship at all, versus income and evaluative well-being, as measured by the best possible life question, correlate all the way up the income ladder. So what does this mean? It basically that after a certain point, more income won't make you smile more, it won't make you enjoy your friends more, it won't make you enjoy your commute more. It's not going to make you have better moods. But income does give you choices to lead the kinds of lives you want to lead, and that shows up in the responses to evaluative questions. We find something very similar in Latin America. We find that after having enough food to eat, the most important variable to the life satisfaction of the poor, defined roughly as people below median income, are friends and family they can rely on in times of need. Versus the most important variable to the rich, again roughly defined as people above median income, are their work and their health. Now, you could say, well, the rich are greedy jerks. They don't care about their friends and family. Well, it turns out they do. But work and health are the agency that people with means have to lead the kinds of lives they want to lead, whether if they want to seek fulfillment or not. Related to that is what I call the Adaptation Conundrum, which is a challenge for this approach in general. Adaptations are psychological defense mechanisms, and I think that those with limited means may emphasize the daily experience dimension of well-being over life evaluation as a way to preserve psychological well-being in the face of adverse circumstances. That's probably a really good thing from an individual psychological perspective, but I think it's probably an explanation for why some societies get stuck in really bad equilibrium. If everybody adapts, right? It's okay. You get used to lots of crime and corruption or whatever it might be. Then people don't push for change. And just from my own perspective, I'm from Latin America. I had the tires stolen off my Honda in front of my house in Northwest D.C. And I was busy waving to my kids, get in the car, didn't even look at it, but it won't go anywhere. The motor's on it. I get out, and the tires are off it. It's on blocks. I'm like, this is crazy. This doesn't happen. So it was a big event, ruined my day. I was absolutely outraged. If I'd been in Peru, where I'm from, and spent a lot of time, my reaction would have been completely different. It would have been, you idiot, why did you leave the car out on the street? You knew the tires would get stolen, right? So people adapt, are good at saying, sort of, well, this level of crime is acceptable here. But if everybody's adapting, you see why a lot of societies sort of adapt to bad norms of health, all kinds of things. One thing that we find is that individuals are better able to adapt to unpleasant certainty than they are to uncertainty, particularly even in the health arena. So people are better able to deal with a mobility issue and return to their basic levels of well-being than with a condition that's constant uncertainty, like uncontrolled epilepsy or something like that. So here's a great example of this. This is the U.S. during the financial crisis. This is daily data from the Gallup poll, the daily poll, 1,000 Americans a day. It's a nationally representative sample, not the same people every day, but and the blue line is the Dow Jones. The red line is average levels of well-being or life satisfaction in the United States, and that's January 2008 through January 2010. So as you can see, when the Dow tumbles, there's the Lehman crash and everything else, average happiness levels fell dramatically. So they fell 11% in 6 months in the United States. Remember, they didn't move at all for 3 decades of very rapid growth. An 11% drop is huge, right? And then you've got 2 spikes. One is Obama's inauguration, and the other is Valentine's Day. But otherwise, you had sort of a free fall in well-being until the bottom stopped falling out of the markets. And I'm sure most of you remember that point where, when it was, when is this going to stop? How much am I going to lose? Am I going to lose my house, my retirement? And then things sort of stabilized. And then the markets sort of slowly sputter up, and average levels of well-being go back up to where they were before, even a little bit higher. And this is even adjusting for a problem in the data that Angus Deaton has found. Any way you adjust, you still find a huge recovery in well-being. And even though the same respondents are saying their economic situation is worse than it was before. So this isn't a Pollyanna effect. It's just, okay, I've lost so much, now I can adapt and cope. Related to that, as much as people can adapt to unpleasant certainty, they seem to have a really difficult time with uncertainty, even that which is associated with progress. So we've found a number of progress paradoxes. What got me into this whole study was these happy peasants and frustrated achievers. I was measuring upward mobility among respondents in developing countries like Peru, and I kept finding that people with lots of upward mobility would report to be unhappy and that their situation was worse than it was before, and then very poor people who hadn't had any income change at all would say they were happy or that they were satisfied with their economic situation. And it had to do with the fact that these upward trajectories also increased expectations. Things were uncertain. Inequality might have been increasing. Lots of other things. As people went up the income ladder, they became more aware of how other people lived. And related to that, we find something called the paradox of unhappy growth around the world. So this is, again, the Gallup from the Gallup World Poll, and this is controlling for GDP levels, right? So we know that on average, people in countries with higher levels of GDP are, on average, more satisfied with their lives. Controlling for that, we found that the economic growth rate was negatively associated with life satisfaction, the standard of living, and health satisfaction. So this seems cuckoo, right? Because you need growth to get the higher levels. Well, it turns out when we went into what is driving this, it was not poor countries getting out of extreme poverty. It was not the U.S. growing at 2.2 rather than 2.3%. It was the rapid growing middle income countries, the Chinas, the Brazils, the Koreas, countries growing at 8, 10, 14%. And those, China now has had, an unbelievably unprecedented, chain of growth. going like this. Life satisfaction's been going like that. And the Chinese government's very worried about unhappiness. What is it? Rapid growth is unsettling. It creates a lot of uncertainty. It creates changing rewards to different skill sets. It increases inequality. All kinds of things associated with negative levels of well-being. Over time, you'll get an increase in well-being levels. They'll catch up as things get a little more stable. But uncertainty is really bad for well-being. So I think this helps explain why often when we think about social outbursts or social protest or public protest, why it's often in unexpected places. And if you think about, we've been looking at the traits of the protesters around the world in recent countries over the past 5 years, stress, worry, anger, all kinds of things. All of these places, Russia, Brazil, Chile, Thailand, Ukraine's a little bit different, but they're countries that are growing. These aren't countries mired in deep stagnation. So it helps, I think this helps you understand why social unrest occurs in seemingly unpredictable times, and yet in other places you think should blow up because things are bad, but they're just in bad equilibrium, it doesn't occur. Okay, just a couple more quick things. One of the things we're trying to understand now related to this is, maybe you do need some frustration to drive the search for progress, or at least to drive change. We've been looking at, for example, different dimensions of well-being and major change. We find everybody always finds that migrants are less happy than non-migrants in their place of destination, right? And the idea is, well, they're unhappy when they get to where they get because expectations are up and they've left their family behind and all kinds of things. So it turns out we've been using intent to migrate data, and we find that migrants, or people who intend to migrate in the next year, are actually less happy before they go. And they're typically more educated and wealthier than the average, at least in Latin America. So these are people with, something is driving change, and they have the means to execute change. But they're also frustrated or unhappy. We looked at well-being trends pre and post the Arab Spring rebellions. We're doing more work on that. One of the things is what do these two dimensions of well-being, do they cause different things? We found in some work that happier people are healthier and they earn more income than the average. Well, it turns out, if you look at the dimensions of well-being, people who are simply content in the Benthamite sense, simply satisfied with their jobs, are no more productive than the average. But people who report to do meaningful work or to be appreciated for the work they do at work are more productive than the average. Now, there's a direction of causality problem, because it could be that you're more productive precisely because you think you do meaningful work. But the idea is that the two dimensions of well-being may correlate with different behaviors. And then lastly, the most recent work we've been doing is looking at different behaviors depending on where in the well-being distribution people are. It turns out the happiest respondents value income and employment the least, or those are the least important variables to their well-being, but they value learning and creativity a lot. So then there's some other work that shows that the very happiest respondents are sort of outliers. So anyway, that's all work in progress. So just 2 points about taking these metrics and using them in the policy realm. There's a lot that we haven't resolved, and I think, for example, the adaptation puzzle is one that we need to worry a lot about. Another issue is that a lot of people want one happiness index. Let's have Jeff Sachs is calling for happiness to be the 9th Millennium Development Goal, just a happiness metric. But everybody that's involved in the more detailed study of well-being, thinks one measure is terrible because it combines this hedonic dimension and with evaluative well-being. It sort of mixes and matches everything, and that we really need to measure these dimensions separately. A very easy thing to do, as the British have done, is simply to add some of these questions into ongoing statistical gathering efforts. The British used 5 questions that work very well. One is general life satisfaction, evaluative well-being, relative life satisfaction, the best possible life question. Then they asked a positive and negative question for experience well-being. So how often did you smile yesterday, or how happy were you yesterday? I don't remember which they used. And then they asked a question about stress and a question about worry yesterday. And then they actually ask a question, an Aristotelian question, do you have purpose or meaning in your life? It's a question, that dimension we know least about. We don't know as well how those questions track across people, but I think it's one we should be exploring. Rather interestingly, I got the state of, there are a lot of local level efforts in the United States now to include these metrics. So the state of Vermont, I love Vermont, I spent a lot of time in Vermont. It's not a surprise, the state of Vermont is one of the leaders in this. And they put the British questions into their survey. I got them in there, right? I convinced them to. Turns out that Vermonters scored very similar to the average person in the UK, maybe a teeny bit higher on some of these things, with the exception of that life purpose question, and then people in Vermont scored significantly higher than people in the UK. And I think that reflects, to some extent, the selection bias that a lot of people move to Vermont with a reason or purpose. So that, I think, is the dimension of well-being that we know least about, that I'm actually the most interested in. Then there's some things we don't know. One is cardinality versus ordinality. These questions do not have cardinal weight, right? We're simply asking people to put themselves on a scale from 0 to 10. But 10 is not 10 times more than 0 in life satisfaction terms. But for policy, should we worry more about reducing the misery of the miserable than we do, say, making somebody who's already somewhat happy much happier? You know, I don't know. That's a normative question, but that's something that we need to deal with. Another issue I mentioned earlier is what's a meaningful change in well-being? How do we know? Do we translate this? You know, how do we translate this for the public? So the average Joe reads a paper and they read that the unemployment rate went up by 1%. They can't tell you how many people were unemployed by that change. They can't, no idea probably, but they know that's a meaningful change, right? If we tell people, well, you know, the average life satisfaction in the U.S. went up from 6.5 to 7.2 in the past year, well, we know that is a meaningful change because these things don't move that much, and that's a big change. But that we still need a metric and sort of a conceptual frame to translate that for the public, and so that still needs a lot more thinking. Should we measure have hedonic metrics in the policy realm? Our National Academy's report certainly says yes. The other thing about it is I think we do care how people are experiencing their lives and the quality of those lives, but also daily experience. If daily experiences are bad enough, they can undermine longer-term objectives. There's a great paper by Alan Kruger who shows that the time that the unemployed spend in job searches is the saddest time of the day. And the longer those searches last, the more likely people are to give up and just drop out of the labor force. So there are other examples where if things at a daily level are bad enough, people will give up longer-term objectives. And then this whole issue of evaluative and eudaimonic well-being, I think better understanding people's capacity to lead fulfilling lives, to make choices, and to have opportunities for life fulfillment is a more natural objective of policy. I think it's probably the most exciting area that well-being metrics can contribute to, but we have a lot more to learn. And then finally, I think we have to accept that happiness is a much more complicated concept than income, even in all the different terminologies. There's still a lot of debate on what we're trying to measure. We're getting better at explaining that and understanding that. But with income, we can measure income and compare people's incomes, and we know pretty much exactly what we're doing. We're not quite there yet on well-being. But if you remember, it took us decades to get GNP right, to the extent that it is right at all. So it's really not a surprise that this novel, new little science hasn't answered all the questions yet. Even though we have much more to do, we really aren't far from a world in which governments are going to be collecting well-being metrics and comparing them, in relevant time periods with GNP data and other economic data. And I think the most important contribution that you get is not from one metric or another, but what the metrics tell us that's different and give us a much broader picture of human well-being and human experience.